All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling something both fascinating and a tad spooky. Encounters with the devil.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
We've got a whole treasure trove of personal stories, historical records, and even some modern takes on this. Got to be upfront, some people, they take these encounters literally, believe it wholeheartedly,
You're right.
while others, they see them as metaphors, reflections of deeper fears or anxieties. Either way, we're in for some pretty captivating stories, say. Ready to explore.
Absolutely. It's amazing how these stories, they pop up across centuries and from such diverse sources. And yet there are these common threads, these similarities that just jump out at you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got this Irish knight from way back in the 12th century describing the devil as this monstrous giant, literally devouring people.
It's wild.
Then you fast forward to today, and there's a guy on Quora who claims the devil offered him, like, his deepest desires while wearing a business suit.
Same devil, different wardrobe.
It makes you wonder.
It really does. You know, that contrast really underscores how the devil's image, it's evolved over time, right? Reflecting the changing anxieties of each era. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
Let's explore those common threads you mentioned. A lot of these personal encounters, no matter when they happened, share some very specific details.
Oh, yeah. It's like spooky stuff. Shadowy figures, those piercing red eyes, a feeling of, like, intense cold.
Or that feeling of losing control.
Exactly. It's like you're reading a horror movie script, but then you remember these are real people claiming to have lived through this. Take Marcus Stanek, for instance.
Oh, I remember that story.
A 10-year-old boy who said he saw the devil, like levitating in a forest in Missouri. Those details, they stay with you.
They really do, and that consistency across so many different accounts, that's what makes this topic so compelling. And often these encounters, they go hand in hand with visions of hell.
Right, and even hell, that's not always a straightforward picture. You've got the classic fire and brimstone, but some sources describe it as like a ruined city overrun with swamps. And there's this chained devil just screaming in the middle of it all.
Yeah, that's the vision described by Anne Catherine Emmerich. She was a mystic, lived in the 18th and 19th centuries. And get this, she even predicted the devil's release before the year 2000. Imagine having those kinds of visions all the time. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the power of belief.
Definitely. But it's important to note that hell, it's not just about physical suffering, right? A lot of the descriptions, they emphasize the mental torment, the psychological anguish.
That's a great point. Do you think we could dig into that a bit more? What forms does this psychological torment take based on what we found?
Sure. Some accounts describe this feeling of utter isolation, like being completely cut off from anything good, anything comforting.
Right.
Others talk about relentless guilt and despair, like facing the consequences of your actions for eternity. It's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting how the descriptions of hell often mirror the anxieties of the time they came from. Early on, when physical suffering was more common, hell was this place of fire and torture. But as we've moved towards a more psychologically driven understanding of ourselves, well, hell becomes this place of mental anguish and spiritual despair. What do you think about that connection?
It's fascinating. It's almost like hell is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears, whatever those might be at any given time. But let's shift gears a bit, if you're up for it.
Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about another aspect of these encounters that always gives me chills. Demonic possession.
Ah, yes. Possession. We're talking sudden changes in behavior, speaking in unknown languages, even displays of superhuman strength. It's pretty intense.
Well, like something out of a horror movie, right? But these accounts, they're often presented as fact, which really begs the question, how much of this is mental illness and how much is something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question. The sources we have, they describe some pretty dramatic exorcisms, and those don't always end well.
Yeah, like the case of Michael Taylor in the UK. He went through an exorcism in the 70s, and afterward, tragically, he murdered his wife, claimed he was released from evil.
A truly tragic outcome, and it really blurs those lines of responsibility, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It makes you think. And that brings us to another question. How much influence does the devil have on our world beyond these direct encounters? Some sources suggest it's more subtle, woven into our culture, even our natural surroundings.
You're talking about things like hidden messages in music or art, or maybe natural phenomena being seen as the devil's work. There's a long history of folks attributing, unexplained events or those creepy patterns to the devil's influence, like take the blood falls in Antarctica.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that like a natural phenomenon?
It is. It's this natural phenomenon where iron oxide tainted water flows from a glacier, creating this like striking blood red color.
Okay. Well,
But some people, they see it as like a sign of something darker, like a portal to hell or the devil's own blood seeping into the world.
whoa. That's intense. And I guess it speaks to how our interpretations of the world, how they can be shaped by these beliefs, right? Good and evil.
Right. It's like we're wired to find patterns, to look for explanations.
And sometimes blaming the devil is just, well, the easiest answer.
It is a way of making sense of the chaos, right? Finding someone or something else to blame for the things we can't control.
Definitely. So we've got these direct encounters, the visions of hell, the possibility of like a subtle influence at play. But what about those stories, the ones where people claim to have made deals with the devil?
The classic Faustian bargain. Trading your soul for talent, power, or wealth. These stories, they've been around forever, and they often pop up around individuals who achieved extraordinary things.
Leading people to think, well, they must have had some supernatural help.
Exactly. It's like, did they really get that good that fast without some kind of demonic assistance?
Like the violinist, Niccolo Paganini. People whispered he made a deal with the devil for those insane skills.
Right. It's almost like the ultimate compliment, but in a really twisted way.
Totally. I mean, it speaks to the enduring power of the myth, but it also makes you think, if the devil is really out there offering these gifts, what's the real cost? What's the price of success? At what point does ambition cross the line into, well, a deal with the devil?
Yeah. It's a question a lot of artists, musicians, probably anyone striving for greatness has grappled with.
I bet. Okay, let's flip the script a little bit. Instead of the devil granting favors, what if he's actively causing bad things to happen in the world?
You're talking about demonic inspiration or influence, especially when it comes to crimes. We see this in cases where people say they were driven by demonic forces.
Like they were following orders, basically.
Yeah, essentially, like
Yeah.
the Manson family murders, for example. Charles Manson and his followers, they believed they were starting a race war, and they saw that as fulfilling some biblical prophecy.
They even carved an X into their forehead, referencing the mark of the beast.
Exactly. And then you have Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who terrorized Los Angeles. He was really into Satanism, left satanic symbols at crime scenes, even said he'd met the devil himself.
It's scary stuff. But it's hard to know, right? How much of that was true belief, how much was just justifying their actions, and how much was manipulation.
That ambiguity, it's a constant in a lot of these stories. It's like, where does personal responsibility end and demonic influence begin? Is the devil truly controlling people, or is he more like whispering in their ear, taking advantage of their weaknesses?
A question that's been around for ages, it seems. And our sources, they don't exactly give us a clear answer, but they do show how these beliefs about the devil, how they can be used to explain, or maybe even excuse, some truly terrible things.
That's so important to remember. Even though we're exploring these stories and beliefs, we're not condoning the actions of people who claim demonic influence. It's about trying to understand the human mind and how these beliefs can play out in real-world events.
Totally. And speaking of complexities, remember how we were talking about the changing image of the devil? He's been portrayed as this monstrous giant, then a chained figure screaming in hell, and now, like you said, a slick businessman in a suit.
It's almost like he's this chameleon, changing with the times.
Adapting to our fears and anxieties.
You got it. And maybe, just maybe, that's part of what makes him so powerful.
The ability to shapeshift, to become whatever we fear most.
It's definitely food for thought. If the devil's image is always changing, does that mean evil itself is changing? Or is it just our perception of it that's shifting?
Ooh, that's a good question. What do you think?
It's a tough one, I think in a way, yeah, the core of evil, that violation of what we consider good and moral, that probably stays the same. But the ways we see it, how it expresses itself, the forms it takes, those definitely shift with us, with our culture, how we understand the world.
So it's not that evil is changing, it's more like our understanding of it is constantly evolving. And maybe that's what the devil has to change too. He's got to stay relevant, tap into our deepest fears, whatever those may be at the time.
Exactly. He's a reflection of our anxieties, not some, static figure stuck in time. And that's what makes these stories, whether you take them literally or as metaphors, so powerful. They force us to confront the darkness, both inside ourselves and out there in the world.
We've covered so much ground here, it's wild. And after all these accounts, I'm really curious, how do you think about the nature of evil? Do you see it as this, external force separate from us? Or is it more intertwined with human nature, something we all have the potential for?
Me personally, I'm leaning towards the latter. I think these stories, even the ones that paint the devil as a real being, they're ultimately about our own capacity for darkness. They remind us that we all have choices, and those choices have consequences.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. It's not about blaming some outside force, but about owning our actions and the impact we have.
Exactly. Maybe that's the real lesson here, right? Recognizing that potential for evil within ourselves, understanding how it can show up, and then actively choosing a different way.
It's like that saying, the only way to fight darkness is to shine a light. But that light, it has to come from within, doesn't it? Cultivating compassion, empathy, courage, standing up for what's right, even when it's hard.
You nailed it. It's about making those choices every single day to be a force for good.
So to our listener on there, we've walked you through these incredible accounts, the chilling similarities, the changing face of evil. What stands out to you? What's sticking with you after this?
Maybe it's made you question your own beliefs about good and bad, or maybe it sparked a memory, something you couldn't quite explain. A time you felt a presence, an unsettling feeling that just hung around.
Or maybe you see the devil's influence not in these dramatic encounters, but in the everyday evils we see. The acts of cruelty, betrayals, those systems that just perpetuate injustice.
Whatever you're taking away from this, we hope it's given you something to think about. Because ultimately, these stories, regardless of how literally we take them, they're about grappling with these massive human questions. What is evil? Where does it come from? And how do we, as individuals, as a society, confront it and choose a different path?
It's heavy stuff, but it's important. And with that, we'll leave you with this final thought. If the devil really is out there, maybe his greatest power isn't causing bad things to happen, but making us question good and evil within ourselves. That uncertainty, that self-doubt, maybe that's where the real battle is.
So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving. Until next time.